Okay, we are live here for another episode of Back to the Past. Streaming live on Facebook, recording it for YouTube, and to put it on a podcast and live in person at the South Euclid Library in Cleveland, Ohio. In South Euclid, Ohio to be exact. So if you're here in Cleveland, you want to join us, come on down. We got some good refreshments. If you're at home, you want a snack, you got to go to the kitchen. And if you're watching this later, just press pause and order a pizza or something like that. But in the meantime, we're going to get started with our trip through Jewish history. We left off last time with the discussion of our forefathers of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the struggle of Yaakov and Esav, and that's where we're picking up. We're picking up right there with the story of Jacob. So Yaakov, when he arrives to Lavan, when he arrives to his soon-to-be father-in-law's house, it's the year 1569 before the Common Era, and he right away falls in love with Rachel. He knows on some higher spiritual level that Rachel is destined to be his life mate, and he goes to her father and starts to make the negotiations to be able to marry her, the dowry, everything. Now at this point, Yaakov was completely broke. He had given all his money away on the journey. A whole story that one of Esav's grandchildren came after him, Eliphaz, but Eliphaz didn't want to kill Yaakov, so he said, you know what, there's a concept of a broke person's like a dead person, just take my money, and you can go back and tell your grandfather that I'm dead, because I have no money. So when he comes to Lavan, he has no money, he has nothing, and he wants to marry Rachel, and so Lavan says, okay, you don't have anything, you don't have a dowry, I don't have a dowry, I'm not going to give you a dowry, and you don't have any self-worth, so you want to marry my daughter Rachel, you got to work for 7 years. Fine. So he plans to work for 7 years. They have the wedding. They go to the wedding. They knew that the soon-to-be father-in-law, Rachel's father, Lavan, was a trickster. So they made up signs amongst themselves. But lo and behold, Lavan tricked Yaakov. He switched out Leah for Rachel, and Rachel did not want Leah to be embarrassed. So she actually gave Leah the signs so that she wouldn't be embarrassed when they gave the signs. And sure enough, Yaakov gets tricked into marrying Leah. Wakes up the next morning, realizes who it is, realizes it's Leah, and says to Lavan, says to his father-in-law, you tricked me, why'd you do this? He said, hey, I don't know how does Riyud come from, but here we don't marry off the younger before the older, so, I'll give you both of them. You want Rachel too? You can work for me another 7 years, and you can marry Rachel as well. So what he proceeds to do is he waits the 1 week that we celebrate for a wedding, the week of Shar Brachos, then he marries Rachel, and he proceeds to work by the way, he worked the first 7 years. He worked the first 7 years before the marriage, and then he marries Leah. Then he marries Rachel a week later, and then he works the next 7 years. So he pays off his debt for Rachel, so to speak, afterwards. Now at that time, he has all of his children. He has 11 out of 12 of his children born there in Haran, in the area where Lavan lives, and he's ready to go back and reunite with his father. He feels that he has the fortitude to finally confront Esav. One of the concepts that our sages tell us is now that Yosef was born, he knew that Yosef was going to be the power that he needed to be able to take on Esav. There's a little bit of a metaphysical ideal over there, maybe we'll get into another time with another class, but be it as it may, he saw that once he had Yosef, he knew that he could take on Esav, and he's ready to go take on Esav. There was only one problem. He had no money, he had no possessions, he had nothing for the past 14 years. Everything had gone to his father-in-law. So he made a deal that he would work another 7 years, and everything from these 7 years he would keep for himself, and then after those 7 years, he finally goes on his journey back to meet up with his father, Yitzchak, and to confront his brother Esav. Now, the confrontation with Esav is a very interesting one that for generations our rabbis have been studying to look at exactly how we confront non-Jews when we have different issues on what to do. And the three approaches he took were first diplomacy. He sends gifts ahead to Esav, hoping to appease him through politics, through diplomacy. The second one was prayers. He prays to God, asking for help to deal with Esav and his interaction with Esav. And the third and final, he prepares for war. He prepares his children, prepares for war, prepares for the battle that he felt he might have to do with Esav. And interestingly enough, if we look at the modern Jewish army in Israel, arguably they take the same approach. Anytime there's a conflict, for sure, Israel always tries diplomacy. We're far away from talking about the modern day state of Israel and the quote-unquote occupation. I never like to call it the occupation, but just so you know what I'm talking about. The fact that the Jews have Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, in their hands, and one of the reasons that was, it's a debate on for whichever government had been in charge. But if you ask Labor, when Labor was in charge, a lot of that was part of it was strategic, part of it was a negotiation piece for diplomacy. When Begin came to power, maybe that changed a little bit, and maybe it hasn't gone back. But be it as it may, the diplomacy is always the first thing we try. We always have prayers involved, and the final thing is we prepare for battle, and that's why we have the IDF nowadays. So we really look at what Yaakov did when he confronted Esau as how we deal with our non-Jewish conflicts when we have them. Be it as it may, Esau is appeased by the diplomacy. He's appeased by the gifts. And the prayers obviously help as well, but the battle never happened. They confront each other, they console each other, and it seems that there is a certain amount of peace amongst them. Now, this is the blessing that we spoke about last time, how when we talk about Yaakov and Esau, Jacob and Esau, the conflict is basically who's on top. Esau says, as long as I'm on top, Yaakov, I'm cool. And now I see you. I got more than you got. I have more possessions. I have more land. I'm on top, so I'm fine. As long as I'm on top, we're good. So at that point in time, Esau lets Yaakov go, doesn't harm him, and Yaakov goes on, Esau goes on, and we're not going to meet them again for a few hundred years. We'll see when we leave Egypt, we're going to come into contact with our cousins again. It's not going to be so positive, but basically that's the rule. Anytime when it seems like the Jews are on top, Esau is there to rear his ugly face. And that's a pattern we will see throughout world history. We'll see when we leave Egypt, Esau's there to stop us. We'll see when we try to come back to when we come to try and build the first temple, Esau's there to stop King Saul and the first Commonwealth. We'll see when the Jews come back to build the second temple. That's Haman, a descendant of Esau, who tries to stop the Jews. We'll see, and we'll see when when we came back to build the modern day state of Israel. What happened first? Unfortunately, we had World War II, which was Esau's ugly face again in history. So that'll always be the rule, that every time the Jewish people are about to get on top, Esau is there to try and stop us. But as long as Esau perceives that he's on top, he lets us go. So Yaakov settles down back in the land of Canaan with his father and he has a few years of tranquility. He basically has 2 years of tranquility. Then after 2 years of his tranquility, that's when the conflict between Yosef and the brothers happened. Now that's a very hard conflict to understand, because here the 12 people involved in the conflict are the 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel. They're what we call the Shiftei Ka. They're the godly placed tribal leaders. So how could people who are regarded them some of the most righteous people in Jewish history, how could these possibly be the people who sell their brother into slavery? How does the whole thing add up? And not only that, we see that the first concept that they had in mind was, let's kill him. Right? It was only Yehuda coming in and saying, man, maybe we shouldn't kill him, maybe we could just sell him in slavery. But what was it that they saw that they figured they could kill their brother? So the idea that I like to give over is that Yosef was his father's favorite son. He was always trying to connect with his father, and to the detriment of his brothers sometimes. He would try and tell on his brothers when they did the wrong things. Again, we know that he was just trying to help them, but that's what he would do. And they saw certain actions in their brother that they thought, we've seen this trick before. We've seen someone who tries to make peace with their father to the detriment of their brother, and dad gives him a special code, dad gives him more than he gives us. I think that Yosef is trying to wipe out 11/12 of the Jewish people before they have a chance to start. He's trying to be Esau over here. He's the same as Esau. And that's really what they thought. They thought that the potential risk of Joseph was the same exact potential risk of Esau. And therefore, just like Esau is there to cause harm to the Jewish people, they felt that they had to get rid of Yosef in order not to wipe themselves out. That's one idea into why they did it. Be it as it may, they do sell him into slavery. And he is in slavery for a long time, for roughly 22 years before the whole thing is reconciled. But we really learn a lot from Yosef during that time. First of all, you can't knock him down. Because here he is, he's sold into slavery. The Torah tells us he goes in the slave market, he goes through several different hands before he even makes it to Egypt. Eventually he makes it to Egypt, and he's sold to Potiphar, who was an official in the Egyptian government. And right away, Potiphar realizes this is a successful guy. He realizes he's a talented guy, and he basically makes him the head of his entire household. He puts him in charge of everything. He lets him do whatever he wants. And okay, he's still a slave. He's not with his father. He's not with his family. But Yosef's like, okay, I can deal with this. Until we have the incident with Potiphar and his wife, where Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph does not succumb. She gets upset that she was rejected, and she frames him. And by the way, Potiphar doesn't believe the framing. The only problem is because he knows Yosef's a great guy. He knows his wife is but nonetheless, the framing was done in a very public way, so much so that he has to respond, and therefore he has to throw Joseph in jail. Now, interestingly enough, the wife of Potiphar had gone to her astrologers, and part of her motivation was really a certain amount, as we say, l'shem shamayim, a heavenly focus, because she learned from her astrologers that she was supposed to have descendants through Joseph. The mistake she made, or her astrologers made, is it wasn't through her. We're going to see the interesting irony in all of this is when Joseph becomes the viceroy of Egypt, who becomes his wife? Asnas bas Potiphara, basically Potiphar's daughter. Potiphar's daughter, and the woman, it's like Mrs. Robinson, reversed a little bit. The movie, you ever saw the movie Mrs. Robinson? Right? It's here, the woman tried to seduce him, the daughter becomes his wife. Be it as it may, he's thrown into jail. And the same thing happens in jail that really happened when he was in Potiphar's wife. He very quickly becomes the head of the jail. He becomes endeared with everybody. Everybody likes him. Everybody loves him. And, you can't knock this guy down. And to a certain extent, that becomes a blueprint for the Jewish people. King Solomon will later say, Sheva yipol tzadik v'kam, that a righteous person falls 7 times and still gets up. And that's what Joseph does. No matter what happens to Joseph, he gets up, he goes again, he fights another day. At any point he can say, I give up, I'm done trying to endear myself with people, I'm done trying to make positive things happen. But he doesn't do that. So he becomes the head of the jail, the head prisoner, if you will. And one day, there's a few people thrown into jail from the Pharaoh's court. The Chamberlain and the head baker are thrown into court on charges of trying to harm the king. And they have dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams, and he says to the baker, I hate to tell you this, but it doesn't look good for you. You're not going to make it out of here. But he tells the Chamberlain, he says, you know what? You're going to be okay. You're going to survive. Paro's going to call you back. And by the way, when you get there, maybe mention me. Maybe mention there's this guy over here in the jail. He's pretty nice to you. Maybe you can find a place for me somewhere else in Egypt besides the jail, and see if you can get me out of here. So that's what he does. 2 years pass. Chamberlain basically forgets about him, and nothing happens until one day Paro has his dreams. Has a dream about the scrawny cows eating the fat cows, the scrawny stalks swelling up the big stalks, doesn't know what to make of it, and all of a sudden the Chamberlain says, 1 second, back when you threw me in jail, I remember there was this Jewish kid who by the way, he doesn't say he was Jewish, he says there was this kid who knew how to interpret dreams. Why don't we bring him in and see if he knows something? So sure enough, they bring Joseph in. He gives an interpretation that resonates with the Pharaoh as being spot on, and he says, you know what? You have such an insight here. I'm not only taking you out of jail, but I'm bringing you into my court. I'm making you my viceroy. I'm putting you in charge of everything. And you know what? You plan for these 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine to follow. Now, it's interesting that if we look at what we know about ancient Egypt was basically broken up into 3 different kingdoms. We had basically the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Empire. So this time period is right basically on the cusp between the Old Kingdom and the New Empire. Now, I'm sorry, the Middle Kingdom and the New Empire. Now, during the Middle Kingdom, from what we know about the Egyptian kings basically were figureheads. They would turn everything over to their viceroy and to their court, and they didn't do anything except sit on the throne and enjoy the high life, so to speak. Like Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. Like that's how they lived. They did whatever they wanted. And so that fits in what we see with Yosef, that here he becomes the viceroy, and he's given over everything to do, because that's what we understand the Egyptians did. And that's where we find the Jews finally in Egypt. Joseph is the viceroy, and this is the situation we have. Now, if we take a step back and go macro a little bit on Egypt and try and understand what this transition from the Middle Empire to the New Empire was, we can understand how the Jews fit into the story. So the New Empire was really a massive empire in more ways than one. First of all, Egypt was very different than most other countries in antiquity, and it really, even in a modern sense, first of all, it's completely landlocked. You have desert on all four sides. You are on three out of four sides. You have this protection of the Sinai Desert to the east. You have all of the Sahara to the west, and it's completely landlocked in that way. But itself, it has the Nile, which supplied everything it ever needed. It gave fertile land, it gave fish, it gave everything. So compared to many other ancient countries, it was a fairly wealthy country. And through this time period of moving from the Middle Kingdom to this new empire, we see that they become tremendously imperialistic. And there's footprints as far as Damascus, and as far as Iraq, and as far as Algeria. We see footprints of this time period of the Egyptians and how far they spread themselves. Now, what's interesting is nowhere in what we know about the Egyptians, which we basically know from hieroglyphics, does it say anything about the Jews. Right? Doesn't say anything about Joseph, doesn't say anything about the Jews, doesn't say anything about the slave people that came in and eventually walked out, doesn't say anything. And so critics of biblical authenticity throughout time have said, you know what? It's because the Torah and the Bible is all just a bunch of fairy tales. It's not historically accurate. And our case in point is the hieroglyphics. Now, let me ask you a question. Who writes histories usually? The victors, right? And who writes the history of a country? The country. And most of the time, how is that history written? It's written to put yourself in the most positive light. So if you had a slave culture, a group of slaves that got up and brought your country to its knees and then walked out one day, would you put that in your history? Absolutely not. And not only that, but about 100 years before they were enslaved, their brother was your viceroy. Would you put that in your history? Probably not. I think about how I was raised in the South. The way we were raised now, it's definitely changed nowadays, but the way we were raised in the South, they taught the Civil War much differently than the way it was taught in the North. Now, again, they taught it ended, and of course the South did lose, and the country came back together, but they played down that South losing a lot. And another example is it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that America had lost Vietnam, right? Until I sort of figured out things on my own. I was never taught in school that America lost Vietnam. So to that extent, that's how the hieroglyphics reflect Egypt. Everything was also always great. What we do know is that this new empire went through a tremendously imperialistic time, conquering a lot of land, very wealthy, the power of the world, and all of a sudden it went through a sharp decline. And that sharp decline happens to coincidentally just coincide with right about the time of the Exodus from Egypt. So their story doesn't tell why they went through a sharp decline. By the way, it's going to be about 500 years before they start to rise again. We're going to see when the Jews finally make it into Israel and start building the first Commonwealth, that they start to recover to a certain extent. But build the first temple, actually, they start to recover. But it takes some time for that. So Egyptian history doesn't tell the story about why they went through the sharp decline, but Jewish history tells us the story about why they went through the sharp decline. Because what happens, we can follow the path of their rise and their fall really through the story of the Jews. Now, interestingly enough, there's a concept of histako ba'araisa bari alma, that when God created the world, he looked in the Torah and then created the world. One of the understandings of this is that many of the things, and we talked about this in one of the previous sessions, many of the stories we see in biblical history and biblical times are really a blueprint for all of Jewish history. And if we look at the story of the Jews in Egypt, it is very much a blueprint for every single step in exile the Jewish people ever went through. Because what happens? You have Joseph. He's invited into the country. Eventually we're going to see his family's invited in with him after the whole confrontation happens. The family's invited in, and the Pharaoh invites them. He says, you know what? You guys seem good for the economy. You have a great plan to save the economy during these years of famine. put it into play. And they put it into play, and the Jews are able to do quite well, and they're aristocracy. But you know what? Early on, they stay separate. They don't assimilate in the Egyptian culture. They don't live in Alexandria, which is probably the main city. They live in Goshen, which is off the beaten track. And our sages tell us that they kept their own names, they kept their own language, they kept separate at first. But eventually, the old crew dies out. Joseph dies, his brothers die, Yaakov dies, everyone had passed away. And then our sages tell us that, they started becoming a little too Egyptian. They started, they shortened their name from Tatovsky down to Tut. They started walking sideways, kind of like this. They started, instead of writing in Hebrew, writing in hieroglyphics. And they became a little too Egyptian. So there's a problem over here. There's a problem over here that we talked about before, the covenant between the parts, that Abraham was told that his descendants are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. And that's going to last a total of 400 years. But we count that 400 years from the birth of Isaac. And everyone asks the question, how do we count it from the birth of Isaac? Isaac did not live in Egypt. The way we understand it is the directive to Abraham is your descendants are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. Isaac lived his whole life in the land of Israel, but it wasn't his yet. And he didn't understand it to be his. Jacob lives part of his life in Israel, part of his life in Haran, but never felt like it was his. And then the Jews are in Egypt, and they, for sure in Egypt, don't feel like it's theirs. But then once they start assimilating, God says, we got a problem here. You're not in the land of Israel or Canaan, you're in Egypt, but you're starting to become a little too comfortable. The deal is we need 400 years to prepare you to be the people that are going to build my nation. And therefore, the last 80 years or so, the Jews are in Egypt a total of 210 years, and the last 80 years is when the slavery takes place. So for the first 130 years, it's pretty good for the Jews in Egypt. But in part, it's pretty good because they remember they were Jews. Once they forget they're Jews, then things get a little shaky. They need that reminder that they're Jews. And that's when the slavery happens. And as we go through this journey of Jewish history together, we'll see that is the blueprint. The Jews get to a country. They're welcomed in. They add to the finance and the government and everything, and the leaders want them there. And then at a certain point, the leadership realizes, you know what? I don't know if we need you anymore. And they throw them out. Interestingly enough, that point of when the leadership says, we don't need you anymore, usually happens when the Jews assimilate into the culture. That's usually when we see it happen. It's a fascinating thing. But if you look throughout history, you look at the Jews in Spain. Jews in Spain were a major part of the government. The Jews in Poland. There was even a Jewish king at one point in Poland. In many Muslim countries, the reason why Jews and Muslims used to get along so well is because the Muslims realized what the Jews could add to the culture. It's interesting. There's a famous book, or an infamous book that we all know about, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which basically says in it that the Jews control the world, the Jews control all the finance, that there's this small group of Jews, the Elders of Zion, that make all the decisions for everything in the world. So that book was widely circulated throughout the world. And it's interesting because that book made it to Japan as well. It was one of the places where it was the most popular was in Japan. Yeah, you got a question? One of the places where it was most popular was in Japan. Now, but the Japanese dealt with it very differently than everyone else in the world. Hitler, Yamach Shemo, had one way of dealing with it. But the Japanese said that if these Jews control everything and they control the finance, then we want them in our country. We want them here. That could be great for our country. And they made a plan that they called the Fugu plan. Now, one of the only Japanese words that I know besides sushi is fugu. Fugu is the Japanese word for blowfish. Now, why did the Japanese refer to their plan of dealing with the Jews as the Fugu plan? Because Japanese blowfish is a delicacy if you prepare it properly. But if you don't, it's toxic and it'll kill you. And that's how they looked at the Jews. That's how they understood the protocols of the Elders of Zion. They said, if we deal with the Jews properly, it'll be tremendous for the Japanese economy. But if we don't, it could be toxic for us. So they call it the Fugu plan. And that's why they welcomed in Jews. And interestingly enough, even though Japan was part of the Axis, they were an ally of Hitler, Yamach Shemo, during World War II, they never turned the Jews over in their empire. Jews were first in Kobe, and then it got a little too rough with Hitler, so they sent them to Shanghai. And there were upwards of 30,000 Jews who were in Shanghai, which was controlled by Japan at the time during the war. That was the Fugu plan. And that's really the blueprint for history. Governments bring us in, they say, hey, you can help us out. And then we become a little too Spanish, a little too Polish, a little too this, a little too that. They say, no, that's not what we want from you. Get out of here. But what's interesting is when we end up leaving the countries, that's usually the end of the country as well. Because we see what's going to happen when we leave Egypt. As we said, Egypt goes through a sharp decline, and that's really the end of Egypt, or at least the Egyptian empire, the new kingdom for a very, very long time. Okay, but we come in, like we said, the first 130 years were great. And then all of a sudden, basically, the Jews multiplied like crazy. The Jews started off as a family of 70, and by the time we leave Egypt, there's going to be about 15 million Jews in Egypt. Only about 3 million are going to leave. Again, part of the blueprint of history. Unfortunately, we see every time the Jews make their stops throughout different places in history, roughly 1/5 survive. And unfortunately, that's often the case. We're from 1/3 to 1/5. And that's what happens in Egypt. Four-fifths of the Jews in Egypt don't get out of Egypt. The ones that get out, the ones that we celebrate Pesach time, that's 1/5 of the Jewish people. Roughly 2 to 3 million Jews. But the Jews are multiplying like crazy, and the Pharaoh, understandably, gets nervous. He says, they're growing, they're a very big part of the population, and being a big part of any population is never a good idea unless you're a majority and can control the population. And he said, we got to do something about this. So he came up with the concept of, we're going to basically trick them into slavery. And he made everybody's going to come out and work, and we're all going to work for the government, and we're all going to work to help the country. And basically what happened was, eventually, at first everyone comes out, and eventually the Egyptians say, okay, maybe not. Maybe we'll pull away a little bit. They start backing away slowly but surely. And before you know it, only the Jews are working. They try and leave, but at that point there's taskmasters to keep them in place. And the Jews find themselves enslaved. And the slavery progresses. At first it's just make bricks. And then the Jews are able to make bricks. They say, okay, you know what? Make bricks without straw. Apparently you put straw into bricks. Make bricks without clay. Do it this way. And eventually, you don't have bricks. Well, we'll put your babies in the wall to be the bricks. Okay, we don't need bricks anymore. Throw your babies in the river. So what starts off as slavery, as a being scared by the Jews, turns out to be straight out genocide. And the difference between Hitler and Pharaoh is nil. Both are basically able to wipe out 4/5, a large amount of the Jewish people under their jurisdiction. Hitler was able to do it in anywhere from 4 to 12 years, depending on how you're looking at the time period. Pharaoh did not have the modern technology that Hitler had, so it took him 80 years to do it. But be it as it may, that's what it was. But the time comes that it's time for the Jews to go out. The 400 years have elapsed, and it's time for the redemption. Now, what's interesting is Moses is born in the year 1393 before the Common Era, the year 2368 on the Jewish calendar, and the first 80 years of his life has nothing to do with the Jewish people. Now he knows he's Jewish, but he's actually raised in the house of Pharaoh. We have the story of he was thrown into the river, and Bisia the daughter of Paro, sees him and takes him into Pharaoh's house. So what's interesting is here, like the enemy lies within, is very much what Pharaoh had, because the one who eventually is going to bring him down, or really it's probably his son, Ramses II, the one who eventually brings him down was right there in the house with him. But Moses, at the age of roughly 30, goes out he knows he's Jewish, he knows he's connected to the slave people. He goes out to see what's doing with his people, and he's appalled by what he finds, both the fact that they're enslaved and the way that they deal with each other. A certain incident happens where he sees the taskmaster whipping a Jew. He kills the taskmaster. The Jew's telling him. He says, you know what? I can't deal with these people. I can't do anything for them. Now I got to run away because Pharaoh has got a number on my back. And he runs off to Midian, to countries west of Egypt. And he's there literally for 50 years. Now, we don't know anything about it from the Torah. What we know about his time period in those 50 years, we only know from the commentators, from the Midrashim. But he lives for 50 years away from Egypt. And he is, at that time, where we understand he's basically a king. He marries into the family of Yisro, who Yisro himself was a king. And he's aristocracy in and of himself at that point. Now, just to get our years straight here, so it's roughly 1363 before the Common Era when Moses leaves Egypt. Joshua was born in 1355 before the Common Era. Caleb, who is Joshua's assistant, is born in 1351 before the Common Era. And then in 1314 before the Common Era, 2447 on the Jewish calendar, that's when the burning bush takes place. Moses is off. He sees the bush burning and not consumed. He goes in to see what's going on, and he gets his first prophecy basically being told that he has to be the one to go back and save the Jewish people. By the way, that takes place on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, exactly 1 year before the Jewish people will be redeemed. The whole process takes 1 year to bring the Jewish people to their redemption. So the 15th of Nisan, Moses starts making his way back to Egypt, and on the first day of the month of is when the very first plague takes place. So we have Nisan, we have Iyar, we have Sivan, Tammuz, and Av. 5 months later, that's that beginning process of Moses saying to Pharaoh, let my people go, throws the staff down, turns to a snake, the snake eats the other ones, that whole situation. That all takes about 5 months. After, in that 5 month period, it becomes 4.5 months. It becomes clear that Pharaoh is not just going to let the Jews go. That's when the first plague comes. And each plague took exactly 1 month. It was 1 week of whatever it was, blood, frogs, lice, locusts, and it was 3 weeks of reprieve. So 1 week of plague, 3 weeks of reprieve, each plague taking basically a total of 1 month. Now, by the time we come to the first of the month of Tishrei, which is only 2 months into the process, basically after the second plague, at that point the Jews are already free from being slaves. They no longer have to. Now they're not free from Egypt. They're still in Egypt, but the servitude, the slavery of the Jewish people stops already 6 months before the actual Exodus on the first day of the month of Tishrei. Now it's going to be another 6 months before they get out. And it's interesting because there's a strange thing about the Jewish calendar that Rosh Hashanah goes by Tishrei, right? Our years we count from Tishrei, the first day of the month of Tishrei. But the months we count differently, right? Tishrei is actually the 7th month. The first month is Nisan, which is weird because how do we count our years different than months? So the reason for that is because Nisan is the month when we went out of Egypt, but Tishrei is the month when the slavery stopped. So therefore we commemorate both of them by putting the years based on Tishrei, but the months based on Nisan. So finally, on the 15th of Nisan, after the 10th plague, at that point the Egyptian economy is totally broken, it's brought to its knees. We see 80% of the Jews don't leave, but that 2 to 3 million do leave, and they go out in the middle of the day with pomp and circumstances, not in the middle of the night, to make it clear that we are leaving because we want to leave. And that's what happens. So next week when we continue, we're going to continue with the beginning of the Jews in the desert, with the splitting of the sea, and what happens is the Jews travel through the desert until they come to the land of Israel and begin to settle the land of Israel. Hope you'll join us next week here for the live stream on Facebook. It'll be posted later on YouTube and the podcast as well. Everybody have a tremendous week, and we'll look forward to talking to you more next week.